I'm not even sure where to begin. I kind of want to begin almost where you guys were ending and then work our way back.
Okay.
Right. So this is Stalinism.
Oh, yeah.
You know, this is a kind of Neo-Stalinism, and China is taking the place that the Soviet Union used to occupy for Stalinists back in, I don't know, the 50s and 60s. Right. And so it's very much of a piece with, you know, there's a lot of Marxist-Leninism out there. We've talked about that, a kind of Neo-Stalinism, a kind of Neo-Maoism, and a kind of a strange kind of Stalinism and Maoism that is willing to basically argue for the socialist bona fides of the capitalist rotor revisionist Chinese Communist Party and, you know, Communist China, which the Maoists themselves call fascist. The actual Maoists, right, call Xi Jinping's China and Deng Xiaoping's China fascist. And I'll just start out very polemically in terms of what I mean by Stalinism. You know, they were talking about revolutionary defeatism. What they're really talking about is bourgeois defeatism. It's not revolutionary defeatism at all. In other words, there's a petty bourgeois democratic anti-imperialism that they are expressing. And that is the essence of Stalinism. It's the liquidation of proletarian socialism into petty bourgeois radical democracy. And that's why they like this kind of stuff, this kind of, you know, authoritarian, conformist, Bonapartist stuff, you know, state socialism, whatever you want to call it, state capitalism, it doesn't matter, you know, but that is what it's ultimately about. And so, you know, you would raise the question, right, what is capital? Because very quickly it's going to move in a direction of real capital versus fictitious capital. And we've talked about this. You know, Wall Street is here. Wall Street is here. And, you know, the reason that China's not going to lead the world to socialism is that China's going to experience a crisis and collapse like the Soviet Union did. It will. So I'm not saying it's going to happen tomorrow or in 30 years, but it's going to happen. The Soviet Union collapsed in a way that even Weimar Republic Germany didn't collapse. And that certainly Britain and France and Japan and the United States they have never collapsed like that, and they're not going to collapse like that. The Soviet Union collapsed. And the reason why is that the bureaucracy at a certain point, you know, this is Trotskyism, they just gave up the ghost. They were like, yeah, we can't pretend to be Marxists and socialists anymore, right? We got to save what we can here. And, you know, the bureaucracy converted itself into a capitalist ruling class and into tin pot dictatorship like every developing country. But with a massive collapse, like a massive collapse and human devastation in the former Soviet Union that you haven't seen in the countries that were developed historically as the center of global capitalism. You haven't seen that. You're not going to see that. There's still a huge peasantry in China. There's a lot of rural poverty. You know, it's, you know, they're just not, yeah, it's not going to play out, right? It's Sublation socialism, okay? That's your brand, Doug. Sublation socialism is run by Conrad Hamilton. And the idea is that, you know, Mao did better than Stalin. Deng Xiaoping also did better than Mao and was in continuity with Mao. And Xi Jinping is even doing better. Right? So it's a kind of like a weird, like, celebration of success, I guess. You know, they've kind of figured it out. They've kind of gotten the formula right, you know, to increase the means of production. Because at the end of the day, they do think it's a kind of an objective process. You know, I would say there's an objective process of catastrophe. You know, I'm an Adornoite, you know. They would say there's an objective process of progress, of social progress. And once you do that, then you can just find a justification for that anywhere. You can say, objectively, the Islamic Republic of Iran, despite its crazy reactionary Islamic fundamentalist ideology, is a force for progress objectively because it prevents the US from riding roughshod over the Middle East in the profit motive. Right? And in order to keep themselves in power, they have to serve their people. That's the petty bourgeois democracy. Right? So, yeah, if you held a liberal democratic election tomorrow, you might have a color revolution in Iran, and so they'd be against that. right? But they would basically say, as undemocratic as the Islamic Republic seems to be, or Communist China seems to be, they are democratic because, after all, they're serving the people, if only for protecting them against Wall Street. You know, Oliver Stone might agree. All sorts of people might agree. Noam Chomsky might agree.
Oh, I don't know. Would he? Maybe.
He might, because again, the lowest common denominator of all this is petty bourgeois democracy, anti-imperialism. I was a goon for Wall Street throughout my.
All right. Hello. Welcome, Alexander. How are you doing today?
I'm doing all right. How are you?
I'm doing all right. And I should say, welcome to Morbid Symptoms podcast. And we're doing our second, but our inaugural Bad Trot's Take with Alexander Mckay, where the idea is we take a deep dive, or mainly, with Alexander, to some of the most controversial or provocative, or you could say quite heated debates within the leftist or Marxist landscape. And today we're going to be looking at Chris Cutrone, who I think about 2 months ago, and I was just playing some of the clips on Sublation magazine. I think they have a regular CutroneZone episode they do. He was talking about Neo-Stalinism in reference to the recently launched American Communist Party and Midwestern Marx and infrared, so Haz al-Din, and also I'm assuming talking about contemporary Lenin Marxists in general. And so some shots have been fired. And so I am very happy to have you on. You're our go-to neo-Stalinist.
I object to the term neo.
Thank you. Well, we'll get to that. To have you, you're very much better well placed to comment on his two things. There's kind of the historical overview that he glosses over what's happened and what happened in the Soviet Union and China up and through to today. And then there's also, of course, the theoretical one when before we get into the specifics of it, that basically he wants to say, well, what he calls neo-Stalinism is just basically a dead end, petite bourgeois defeatism. That's basically nothing more than anti-imperialism, who just goes around looking for whoever is anti-American imperialism and kind of latches their pony show onto that. Anyway, before we get into it, is there anything you'd like to get off your chest?
Well, I saw Chris Cutrone in one of those clips you were playing before we started, talking about how he was talking about objective realities, and
Yes.
talking about with reference to Iran and with reference to China, and it would seem that Chris doesn't appreciate objective realities because he's an Adornoite, and I found that was very revealing because, first of all, his characterization of Iran, of like why people support the achievements of the revolution in Iran or the achievements of the revolution in China was, of course, completely cliched rubbish. The fact that there are achievements, not just standing up to US imperialism, but real domestic achievements in both cases, in both countries. This is something which Trotskyites like Chris Cutrone can't handle. So they have to retreat to do what he does there, which is he does a sort of rhetorical dance, claiming that, oh, well, you Stalinists are hiding behind these objective truths. But it is objectively true that life has improved for the great majority of the population in both countries, is it not? And then if he has a problem, he then dances around to sort of suggesting that whatever would happen under a so-called liberal, i.e. a capitalist democracy, would be better. And of course, Doug Lane's vigorously nodding along with him, because of course he doesn't believe that any democratic content exists in either Iran or China. So he's essentially saying the same thing that Trotskyites have said since the 1930s, which is it doesn't matter how many actual achievements exist in these countries. What matters is the fact that I have this theory to which it doesn't quite correspond. and therefore it must be bad. And therefore, if it was removed and replaced with, whatever it is that the US has in mind for it, therefore it must be better, because more democratic equals good. But what his version of democracy really comes down to is he seems to have stripped the class content out of his definition of democracy, and just seems to think that a so-called liberal democracy, i.e. a bourgeois one, must be better. It must be better because there's more individual freedom. That seems to be where he's coming from. And again, it's not original. Trotsky believed in all the same things. He said all the same things. But that struck me as like a great summation of his entire thought, which is objective truths don't matter. Objective realities don't matter, because, we have our theories and we have our the holy trinity of Adorno, Horkheimer, and Herbert Marcuse, who we bow down before. And if it doesn't correspond to the crankish obsessions of all of them, then can't be real socialism. It might as well just be it's all just another form of capitalism. Therefore, it doesn't matter if, the Communist Party of China is overthrown. Therefore, it doesn't matter if a Western comprador regime is reimposed in Iran, because it's all just capitalism. So it doesn't matter which form it takes, according to him.
Yeah, thank you for that. But just to, and I guess before we get into it, I tried to do what I like people to do for me and people who I appreciate, is try to Iron Man his take on what he's calling Neo-Stalinism, which is a broad brush. Again, a straw man, or maybe a more accurate description of the two videos that I saw when he's focusing on this movement in particular, is that it's the anti-imperialism. The common denominator, I think he says this twice, is petty bourgeois defeatism, or petty bourgeois anti-imperialism, tailism. And again, like you said, common theme, they want to focus that I think he would say perhaps that not so much that the objective doesn't matter, but I think he might have been accusing people like Caleb Maupin and Midwestern Marx, and maybe even people like yourself, or organizations like that you belong to, of using that to not have to talk about the bad stuff. So he would say that it's a theocracy when he talked about Iran, or when he talked about Stalinist Russia or China, that they don't want to talk about all the bad stuff. They just want to be like, look, this is the play out of history. It's not about good guys and bad guys. And objectively, this is what's going on. And so as long as they're improving the productive capacity and people's material, the material measures of well-being, whether it be infant mortality or women's education, whatever, going up, then we're not going to talk about any of the other stuff. I think would be probably the most judicious way of him focusing on the saying, oh, they just want to talk about the objective improvements in Iran or China, and not on the other, authoritarian or fascistic, his word, stuff.
Yeah. Well, let's deal with that, because I think that's probably where he's got the closest thing to a point, in my view. So what he describes there, which is essentially a narrow worship of the improvement in the productive forces, that point of view does exist. So I'm not going to come here and say that he's not basing that on nothing. So yes, that point of view that China, referring specifically to China, has been improving the productive forces, and therefore the overall productive capacity of China has gone up since the early 1980s, and therefore the amount of wealth in Chinese society has gone up. And that justifies basically everything. Not just therefore the CPC has proved its worth. Yeah. And I would in here I will put forward my own point of view and my party's point of view, which is contained specifically on China in a book called Socialism with Chinese Characteristics, written by our former chairman and founder Harpal Bra several years ago, which is that China has been on the market road since the late 70s. There's no denying that. There is a bourgeoisie in China. There's no denying that. They are actually members of the Communist Party of China. There's no point denying that. The Chinese leaders are on record as saying it. How we see it is that, yes, China has been on the market route for 40 years. There is, as I said, there is a bourgeoisie there. We see those that and see as a potential problem, because with the reintroduction of capitalism, with the reintroduction of capitalist relations of production into China, what you are doing there is really, if we're going back to objective realities, strengthening the elements within Chinese society that would support full capitalist restoration. That's all true. Full capitalist restoration hasn't happened yet, though, because you still have 60-odd% of the economy which is controlled by state-owned enterprises. You have a very strong organized working class in China, which is, and you have within the Chinese party both revisionist, pro-capitalist wings and revolutionary wings, and a whole load of varying shades of opinion in the middle. And so, to go back to Cutrone's point, we, that is my party, don't avoid those points. Those are all contradictions. There is an active struggle in China. There's obviously a class struggle going on. As Mao observed, the class struggle intensifies after the revolution, because you have a struggle then, even if we didn't have the market in China, even if you hadn't had the market reforms, you have a struggle to overcome the long legacy of a society based on private ownership, be it a feudal one, which is what China was. Capitalism was a sort of stunted creation in China. But you have a long struggle to, as I've mentioned before, raise the cultural and educational level of the working class to the point where it can fulfill its historic destiny in administering society for itself. That is a long form of class struggle that might take several generations. And we, that is my party and those who think along those similar lines to us, would never deny that. In fact, we see it as a crucial part of the struggle for the socialist future. It isn't just that there's a big bang and then everything's fine. You're trying to, not only are you trying to implement improvements in the productive forces, and this is where I would disagree with those who are Dengists, that is, who are admirers of the reforms of Deng Xiaoping. It is not just about improving the productive forces. That, of course, though, is very important. It is about the relations of production as well. So not just how much do we produce and what level of quality is it, but how is it that this production process is organized? What is the role of the working class in setting the standards of production, managing their individual factories, contributing towards the greater economic plan that will develop the country? Goes back to what I was saying about training the working class to be the administrators of the societies they live in, to play their role as the true rulers. That's a struggle. Mao saw that as a struggle that was going to last for several generations. Stalin did as well. So whereas there are people out there who say, and I think he's aiming this towards Caleb Maupin, I don't know, who would say that China is on the path to socialism because it's achieved all this material gains and improvement in the productive forces, and therefore they will achieve their aim of a moderately prosperous socialist society by the 100th anniversary, which is 2049. Now, I don't go down that line completely. I would say I hope they succeed, but I have doubts, and I have my party has theorized this, doubts regarding the market model and its potential impact, and the fact that it's creating more complications in the struggle towards socialism. So going back to Cutrone's point, like, yes, those people who say everything China touches turns to gold and therefore we must follow it. Those people do exist, but that's not where the point of view that I come from. And Cutrone, as he always does, is taking like the lowest common denominator and presenting that as the new Stalinist argument, whereas in actual fact, those who study Stalin and Mao will know very well that it's not just a matter of like nationalize the industries and declare victory, or set a new plan of production and declare victory. That the struggle to build socialism takes place on the economic field, most certainly. It takes place in terms of the organizational field, in terms of how work and how industry is structured. It takes place in the field of social relations, i.e., how do we all relate to each other? It takes place in the form of how communities are organized, how families evolve into the next period of time. That's like my view on this, which is that to boil it down to a narrow productivist take is to bastardize things. Some people do that, but I think that's the reason why Cutrone's picking up on this. He's picking up on the weakest part of his supposed opponent's arguments and turning that and saying this is the new neo-Stalinist line, which of course is a complete cliche.
Yeah. True. And what I just when you were talking about before that that's not just a matter of numbers, like what's the productive capacity in these different sectors, but also very much who's doing it. So is it still a vanguard kind of aristocratic bureaucracy, or is the proletariat being organized to be able to do that for itself? And I think that to get into the state of the China things, as we talk about that, he talks about that. He kind of, again, when he's straw manning the Marxist-Leninists that he calls now Neo-Stalinists, he says basically, well, you know, it used to be that the Soviet Union was the vanguard, but now China's the vanguard, and that model is going to work, and that they don't look at the fact that that he says he claimed that he also wants to help people avoid demoralization and putting their eggs in this basket, because he also said that he thinks at some point, or he's sure at some point, that China's going to have a collapse like the Soviet Union had a collapse, and that's going to be it, and that the bureaucrats will run for the hills. It'll be like Russia Redux or Soviet Union Redux, and then where will we be? And so
he'll be in the exact same place he's in now. So I don't know why he's worried.
Yeah. But so on that point, do you think there's anything to that? And again, I don't have any special insights into what's actually going on in China. I don't think he does either, but no one ever pushes him back on that, where he gets this information from. That he seems to be suggesting that China is quite brittle. And he makes the comparison that when there's a big crisis there, a systemic crisis, that it will collapse, like similar to the Soviet Union did, whereas the United Kingdom or the United States or Germany would not, because of its various, civil freedoms and civil society and this type of thing. Do you think that he is stuck in the past with regards to the current social relations and resiliency of China to be able to withstand some serious economic crisis?
Well, first of all, I would say that Chris Cutrone probably has the incorrect interpretation as to why the Soviet Union collapsed. First of all, I'm going to guess that, I've seen some of his videos, like he's mentioned this, but I'm going to guess he takes his approach seems to be almost that of a sort of Reaganite liberal. Which is that he seems to think that the Soviet Union collapsed because it was brittle and bureaucratic, and then Gorbachev tried to introduce so-called democratic reforms, that it caused the whole system to collapse because it just couldn't stand it. Now, I take another view, which I would venture to say is the more correct view, which is that it's not that the system was working fine before Gorbachev came along. There were a lot of problems there that been developing since the Khrushchev period. But there is no reason why the system couldn't actually overcome those. What was done to the Soviet Union was a deliberate and calculated act of counter-revolution, carried through by a pro-capitalist clique that had grown up during the Khrushchev and Brezhnev periods that fully manifested themselves under Gorbachev. And so the collapse was deliberately carried out by that clique. So it wasn't that Gorbachev was introducing democratic reforms. What he was doing was carrying through a counter-revolution where the last elements of working class power were dismantled and destroyed. So there's that point to make straight away. His interpretation of the collapse of the Soviet Union is incorrect. Now, as to his view on China, he seems to just be echoing what he reads in the bourgeois press uncritically about China. And again, as my previous contribution in this segment was stating, it's not that China is without contradictions. There clearly are contradictions there. There's clearly an active struggle going on inside the Chinese party. It's not that the Chinese party is this dead bureaucratic thing. I don't think the Soviet party was really either, but there were certain problems with it, which, again, I can go into if necessary, but it's probably beyond the scope of our discussion today. But it's certainly the case that within the Chinese party, there are multiple tendencies that are struggling with each other. And you can tell that if you go and read the speeches and contributions of Xi Jinping. If you know the tendencies within the Chinese party, and then you go and read the speeches of the leadership and the written contributions of the leadership, you can see how they're trying to balance all these different factions and all these different points of view. Because often Xi Jinping will start a speech by sounding very revolutionary and talking about the need to train new revolutionaries for a new generation. And then he'll go on to say, and we must continue in the spirit of, he mentions Mao a lot more than some of his predecessors did, Xi Jinping. He's saying, well, we must continue in the spirit of Mao Zedong thought. Then he says, and also Deng Xiaoping theory, also Yang Zemin's theory, also Hu Jintao's theory, because he's got to reference all these different points within the history to sort of satisfy all these different factions within the party. The point and the reason why I'm going through this is that the Chinese party is very much a struggle in process. It's not this dead thing which will fall apart at the moment that there's a crisis. Because if we think about it, Chris has been objectively proven wrong by the last 5 or 6 years. There's been a series of crises in China. There was the Hong Kong crisis of 2019, which US imperialism and British imperialism very much provoked. And were engaged in organizing those protests. So there was a lot of people on the ground there employed directly by the US and the British. They got through that. There was the COVID crisis. Again, it was predicted by all the China watchers in the West, this would be it. Didn't happen. There was the various different crises involving a genuine problem, which is that they'd landed themselves with a housing bubble. And so far, the leadership is managing to deflate that bubble without actually provoking a societal crisis. And you've had Xi Jinping actually say that housing is for living in, not for speculating on. Now, if only we could do that here. But the point being, it's a system which is a lot more democratic and a lot more robust than Chris Cutrone portrays it as. And again, I've already made clear that there are those of us with certain critiques of it, but those critiques are being made inside the Chinese party itself. So it's not this dead and ossified thing where there's no debate at all. There's a lot of debate and there's clearly a lot of disagreement. But what they're good at is, of course, coming to a consensus line at their congresses and then imposing that, fighting for that line out in the country. There's, as I said, there's still a very strong, powerful working class element within the Chinese party. Still a very powerful revolutionary wing, which was sidelined for a while, but which has strengthened in recent years. And you can see that the the fact that the leadership has moved in a more, I would say, back in a more revolutionary direction in recent years is proof of the fact that there is a swing within the party and a battle for influence there and a real debate. Can we say that there's a real debate in civil societal institutions in America? Is that what Chris Cutrone is claiming gives it its strength? Because I've been watching the American presidential election, and I don't see a lot of debate. I mean, does Chris think that this is what is going to secure America against collapse? What, the debates in the U.S. Congress? What, the corporately owned press? What, where are these energetic civil society type organizations in? Where is this democratic spirit in the institutions of the West? Where you can't even, I mean, you and I started our discussions a while back talking about the gender ideology and stuff like that. You get investigated by the authorities for cyberbullying or whatever it is if you get into a disagreement with somebody who believes that who believes quite profoundly that he's become a woman because of some thoughts in his head.
You dead name them.
Yeah. You can also then get your electronic devices confiscated by the state if you tweet in a way they don't like. So where's this vital, strong democratic tradition that Chris Cutrone is hanging on to here? Because it seems to me that he's just taking what an editorial from The Economist, injecting some Adorno into it, and then calling it like his radical critique. Because at each stage he seems to agree with the general bourgeois line, especially on China, which is, it's bureaucratic, it's tyrannical, it's fragile, it's going to fall apart as soon as it hits a crisis. Well, it's hit several crises and it's still there. I'm not saying that there won't be problems there. I've already outlined how I think there are. But the Chinese system has proven robust in facing those so far. I don't think that you can make the claim that he's making about the civil societal institutions of the West being strong, though. I think that is a ludicrous position, and especially ludicrous for a supposed big man Marxist academic to be taking.
Yeah, no, if you look at Kamalaism versus Trumpism, it's hard to think of anything besides a profound morbid symptom. That basically, if we take Trump at the absolute best, he thinks he can somehow unevenly roll back globalization just on a particular few manufacturer sectors, and everything else then it's fine. And cut down on immigration, that's great. And then the other side is like, no, as long as we don't elect Trump, everything's fine. Joy, inclusion. So it's like that doesn't seem particularly robust.
Is Chris on Team Kamala? Do we know?
I don't know. I don't know what I don't.
He is.
Who knows? Who knows? But again, to Iron Man him, my guess is that he would, and I don't want to get too far into this, although there's so much to talk about, and it's so great to talk to you. Is that in addition to the brittleness of the civil society? He does give very much the idea that Lenin Marxists, that he calls now neo-socialists, just kind of, they gather and they have maybe a big map of China and a Stalin statue and Xi Jinping, and they just kind of are just waiting.
Do some genuflections.
Waiting for the historical process to play out, because that's the model and it's fantastic, and we just have to do everything we can to keep American imperialism from gumming up what's going on in China. But I think he also mentioned that maybe one of the reasons why he thinks that China, and I think this is also wrong, based on what I know, the reason why it could fall apart is he's saying, well, we have, a lot of variety of, there's concentrations of capital, but there's private property throughout the United States. And basically like they would be able to get by if there was like, a serious problem. But my understanding is that you could say the same thing about China. It's not like all industry they have a mix of privately and publicly owned industry as well. So I think that kind of falls apart on that note. But unless he seems to be thinking that, and and I don't know, and this could be my romanticization. I did live in China for a year, but that was back in 2001, so it's a while back, and I wasn't focused on these issues then. But the idea that if the crap goes down, that you're going to have a repeat of what his idea of Russia's, which you said, that there's just going to be this massive selling off of public. There's going to be like a basic kleptocracy. A lot of the bureaucrats are going to flee. They're just going to run for the hills, and it's just going to be like this. And then China will just be picked over by Wall Street. Hedge funds and whatnot, which I find hard to believe, not only because China's 2,000 year, 3,000 year civilization. Russia also goes way back, but I just find it kind of convenient on that point as well.
Just on that point, I mean, again, like he's deliberately misunderstanding what went on in the Soviet Union, but also with regard to China, like the Chinese party. And I had a couple of comrades who went from my party who went over there on a visit recently to observe, like in Xinjiang. When they wrote some articles on it when they came back, and what they observed over there was very interesting, because the Chinese party is not a bunch of distant bureaucrats. And I'm by no means here to advocate for Xi Jinping or anything, but I am here to advocate for certain objective realities. I know Chris doesn't like that, but what was observed over there, and to be fair to the Chinese leadership, this is something that Xi Jinping talks about a lot, which is making sure that the party is genuinely rooted in the masses. Yeah, so so that there is no distance between them. Living amongst the masses, this is why I think he references Mao Zedong for a lot, which was much of which was about being among the masses and learning from them. Yeah, and taking that knowledge back into the party, and then using that to reformulate party positions, and then taking it back and testing the new position or policy with the masses. They are still doing that. They are still doing that in many areas of China, especially in the very working class and the peasant heavy areas, which Chris, in a typical Trotskyite fashion, I could see the sneer go up his face when he said peasant. He's the founding father of his tradition, would be very proud. But so the Chinese party is clearly not some distant bureaucratic entity. It clearly has roots amongst the masses. It clearly is. It's cadre live amongst them and learn, and are constantly engaging with them. I mean, again, let's ask ourselves, which system is the more solid? Is it a system where those in positions of authority live in the same conditions of the great majority and live amongst them and learn from them day to day? Or is it the system where you can become a millionaire in 10 years by being elected to Congress? Or is it the system where if you're elected as a Labour MP or a Tory MP in a safe seat, you need never buy a meal again? And you can be basically on a corporate lobbyist payroll for the rest of your life. So which system is the more secure? I think that's a question to be asked, because Chris's view of this, and I will keep harping on upon this point because I think this goes to the center of his errors. His view on this is that of a Cold War liberal academic, which is that our system is robust because we have competitive elections between multiple parties. That's, again, and I'm going back to my undergraduate days where we were taught this. But then again, I think that this is still what they teach
pluralism
to this day. We have pluralism, and pluralism makes us strong, etc. We have a critical press. Well, no, we don't. No, we don't, and we didn't 60 years ago, and we don't now. We have class rule in this society, meaning that you have a bourgeois press, meaning that the points of view in there are those which are deemed acceptable to the ruling class. And if you try and put forward points of view which are really threatening to the ruling class, you will be fired, or you will be sidelined, or you will be given a series of shit jobs that will make you want to quit. They call it
Mhm.
constructive dismissal. You know,
Mhm.
there's many ways in which you can make sure that a
Mhm.
troublesome journalist doesn't make it through into the big leagues.
Mhm.
Or if you're in the Labour Party or even in the Tories, if you're awkward, if you ask too many questions, then you will not get promoted, certainly not to cabinet level, and you will be eased out or just
Mhm.
cancelled
Mhm.
out of your seat. So the fact is that this sort of end stage Trotskyism, which Chris Cutrone is an advocate for, and that Doug Lane is an advocate for as well, like again, like it takes the old Cold War liberal pluralist propaganda
Mhm.
that they were giving out for years and years and years about how strong this was and how strong it made and robust it made our societies, and why it made sure that even in recession the systems would survive because there was a changeover in power. Well,
Mhm.
that might have had some weight to it in the 50s when people believed that changing parties meant something.
Mhm.
Go ask much of the working class in Britain or the United States if Democrat or Republican or Labour or Tory means anything now. Most of them, even if they have all kinds of strange reasons as to why they think this, most workers, I would suspect now, have reached the entirely correct point of view that the differences in the system, any difference between the major parties in the system, drained away a long time ago. That the press, in one form or another, is just there to lie to you. And
Mhm.
most workers have reached that conclusion.
Mhm.
Who is still clinging on to the illusions about this system? It's really the petty bourgeois academic types.
Mhm.
It's the sort of Cold War liberals like Chris Cutrone and Doug Lane, who are still thinking that it's 1973,
Mhm.
and that they're they're fighting the evil Stalinists, and that the bureaucratic entities will collapse sooner or later, and that is why we must maintain the struggle for a pure form of socialism, which basically doesn't come down to revolutionary socialism at all. It comes down to social democracy,
Mhm.
which is all that the two of them. I've seen videos from both of them. What they really advocate for is a revived social democracy. That's what they
Mhm.
both actually want. Lane's a little bit more honest about what he wants. Cutrone hides behind lots of verbiage, but that's really what he's after.
All right. So in the terms of the first thing to check off our list, then, when it comes to his idea that to focus on China as a model of socialism is totally misguided, and that it's not compatible with Marxist principles, you've covered quite well that why you disagree with that, while at the same time not romanticizing China or being blind to the contradictions, which of course are the driving force for how things are playing out in practice. So I think we've taken that off, that you're not. Yes, you would concede that, yeah, there are some people who are basically like, yeah, great for us. China is in the driver's seat. We can just be flanking things from where we are. We don't have to worry about, building the proletarian socialism here, because they're going to be in the driver's seat. And you've quite clearly gone through why you think that is, at the very best, an oversimplification of what would be a Marxist-Leninist position, or what he would call Neo-Stalinism. And by the way, before we go on to this, the difference between revolutionary defeatism and petty and bourgeois defeatism, I think those were his distinctions. That he's saying that what he's calling the Neo-Stalinists think that they're engaged in revolutionary defeatism, but actually they're engaged in petty bourgeois anti-imperialism or democracy. He goes back and forth. But before that, what did you think of the term of Neo-Stalinism?
It's completely nonsensical,
Mhm.
because there's nobody, well, not nobody, but like most of us who are communists, who are guided by the contributions of Stalin, Mao, and also Marx, Engels, and Lenin.
Mhm.
Very few people would actually call themselves that. There
Yeah, I
are a
hadn't heard it
few
before.
people. There are a few people who call themselves Stalinists. I believe that there's a few individual parties that have called themselves that. In, I think, some places in India have done so, but very few people would use that term at all. It's always been a term principally used by Trotskyites. As for Neo-Stalinism, I think he's trying to refer to like the American Communist Party, Caleb Maupin, people like that, again, who all of whom uphold the contributions of Stalin, but wouldn't, I don't think, describe themselves as Stalinists, because Stalin himself always insisted there was no such thing as Stalinism. It was something that's projected onto him by his own enemies. So again, like it's a completely nonsensical term. It's not even his original term. This was first being kicked around in the early 1990s to describe political movements in Eastern Europe that were opposed to mass privatization. The media in the West labeled them as neo-Stalinists, whereas in actual fact, most of them were just social democrats who didn't want the entire economy sold off to basically Wall Street, who I think that Chris Cutrone does have a genuine love for, despite all his attempts at irony.
Okay. Thank you. So now let's get on to the second point that he made. Again, he was saying the common denominator for all this neo-Stalinism, or the current trend in Marxist-Leninist groups, is bourgeois defeatism, or petty bourgeois anti-imperialism. So he seems to want to make a split critiquing what he calls neo-Stalinists for what he calls bourgeois defeatism or petty bourgeois defeatism. He goes back and forth, but I think he usually lands on petty bourgeois instead of revolutionary defeatism. And he claims they replaced proletarian socialism with some sort of petty bourgeois anti-imperialism, populism at best, that isn't going to lead the working class really anywhere, there or here, or whatever the geography is. So he's saying that he doesn't see any benefit in supporting these what he would call authoritarian or even fascist or theocratic or all the bad thing states, whether it be Iran or Putin's Russia or Xi Jinping's China, or Hezbollah and Hamas, all that stuff. He basically says this is all. He even said, I think he goes all the way back, that Che, Fidel, all of this has been one episode of another of what's not proletarian socialism or the struggle for that, but it's actually a form of petty bourgeois anti-imperialism or radical democracy at the best. So your response to that, but also if you could do me a favor and tell me what you give. So for people who don't know, what is meant by revolutionary defeatism vis-a-vis petty bourgeois defeatism, and then what you think about his statement there.
Well, revolutionary defeatism was popularized in the First World War, which is where Lenin observed that the war, of course, was an imperialist war, an inter-imperialist war. So there was nobody in there who was waging a war of national defense. It was a war for the forcible redivision of the world, and therefore the only thing for revolutionaries to do was to work for the defeat of quote unquote their ruling class, because it wasn't a war that could be claimed to be a war of national defense, a war of liberation against imperialism. It was different imperialist powers trying to grab more territory, and therefore working for the defeat of what is referred to as your own ruling class. Well, that was regarded as, and correctly, as a way to, the only correct attitude to actually hold. Try and turn the imperialist war into a war against the ruling class itself, the main enemy being at home. And that was an entirely justified position, and the only correct position to take in 1914. And it's a position that Lenin defended and was vindicated on in the end. Now, Chris would probably argue that, well, the same attitude should be taken now in Ukraine, for instance. That Russia is the imperialist power, and therefore the Russian workers should work for the defeat of their own ruling class. And in here, I don't think I'm mischaracterizing his position now. I think that's exactly what he believes. It's what I've seen him say, and others like him on numerous occasions. Again, the problem with that is, and this is where I'll address his idea that it's petty bourgeois defeatism to support the Russian effort against NATO, because again, like he mischaracterizes the nature of the current Russian state. And the current Russian state is not an imperialist power. It's not an imperialist power for a variety of reasons. The principal among them is that it's a commodity producer and exporter, whereas the imperialist powers of the West are not. They're no longer exporters of commodities. They're exporters of capital. Exporters of capital to try and find markets and resources that can be hyper exploited for higher rates of profit. Russians don't do that. Russians aren't doing that with regard to Ukraine. And if you examine what has been done to Ukraine, i.e. how it has been weaponized by US imperialism for the specific purpose of destabilizing Russia, and again, we don't have to speculate about this. They did us the favor of writing all of this down in plans 30 years ago, which are declassified. You can find it on the US government's own website, where Paul Wolfowitz and others wrote all this down as to what their planning would be. So again, this isn't my speculation. This is taken directly from the works of US planners themselves. So because he's fundamentally and deliberately mischaracterizes the war in Ukraine as being an imperialist one on Russia's behalf, he accuses those of us who support the actions taken by the Russian Federation of being petty bourgeois defeatists, because basically his argument is, well, you're just siding with another form of capitalism, or you're just siding with another form of imperialism. I genuinely don't think he understands Lenin's theory of imperialism, so he'll probably use the two interchangeably. But his argument comes back down to that we are just picking sides that are about the same. But you can't, if you actually understand that the US imperialism and British imperialism, these are the two of the most dominant powers in the world, the two of the most dominant imperialist powers going back over 200 years. You can't compare that to the modern day Russian Federation. This is not something which is even in the same business. Modern day Russian Federation, yes, it's a capitalist power. There's no doubt about that. I'm not trying to deny that the capitalism is the mode of production in Russia. It's quite clear that it is. But the problem with this ultra leftist view that the Trotskyites have is that you end up mistaking a form of capitalism which exists in Russia with an imperialist system. The imperialist system evolves out of capitalism, but the system in Russia hasn't evolved to the point where it has become imperialist yet. And what is being done to Russia, and what has been done since the breakup of the Soviet Union, has been a relentless attempt to further split it up. And again, not speculation on our part. The US imperialists have been very open about their desires and their disappointment that they didn't get to break it up in the 90s.
It's basically, didn't they say that? It was in maybe a couple of months ago. I don't know if it was a Finnish guy or maybe the Dutch guy who basically said that, basically laid out how they want to balkanize it. They want to break it down into bits.
Mark Rutte, I think he's I don't know if he said it, but certainly it's a common talking point amongst NATO aligned think tanks and also people in the power structure in London and in Washington. And we go all the way back to 92 and Paul Wolfowitz saying that we should not allow a powerful rival to emerge on the territory of the former Soviet Union. Should not allow it. And that's what they've been working towards for decades. So these ideas the ideas either are that they replace Putin with a Yeltsin figure, though they would probably prefer one that wasn't quite as drunk. At this stage, though, they'd probably take Yeltsin coming back from the dead, or they break the country up entirely. Those are the two plans they're working off. Ukraine was a tool to achieve that, and that is why, of course, they have condemned Ukraine to a thousand upon thousands upon thousands of bloody deaths, because it's a tool to be used to open up access to the unlimited pillaging of Russian natural resources. Again, not speculation. These are all things which are out in the open. If you just look beneath the surface. To go back to Chris Cutrone's point, he argues that Russia's waging an imperialist war. Therefore, those of us who are siding with one or the other are just siding with another form of capitalism. Therefore, we've given up the revolutionary struggle, we've sold out, we embrace Putinism, etc. Well, in actual fact, I would turn it around on him and say, objectively speaking, by misleading the people who follow him, by mischaracterizing the nature of imperialism and the nature of this war in Ukraine, it is Chris Cutrone who is taking a side, and he's taken the side of US imperialism, as he consistently seems to do, as we've discussed last time with regard to his view on the Israel question. Like, he and his followers consistently hide themselves behind this sort of ultra-revolutionary rhetoric. But when it comes down to it, what he's really concerned with is actually preserving the power of US imperialism. Because he's made it quite clear that he prefers US imperialism to all other forms of revolution, going all the way back to the days of Stalin and Mao. Like, he denounces the Cuban Revolution for all the undeniable progress that made. I'm sure he'd denounce the Korean Revolution. I'm sure he would denounce basically every revolution that's existed, no matter what that it has achieved since his beloved Trotsky bought the ice pick back in 1940. So if whenever any struggle comes up that you are objectively, to use Chris's favorite word, taking the side of imperialism by denouncing furiously every other form of revolutionary struggle, then really there's only one thing you're doing there, is you're siding with imperialism. Now, some of the Trotskyites are a little bit more open about that being what they are doing, but that's been the case going all the way back to Trotsky himself, who was openly calling for the Soviet Union to be broken up in the late 1930s. There's articles on the Marxist Internet Archive where he calls for this. And who do we think that would have benefited, breaking up the Soviet Union prior to World War II? Well, I think it might have been the man I refer to as the failed Austrian watercolor artist and his ambitions. You know?
Yeah.
But, I mean, this is, just to conclude the point, this is a consistent thing ever since Trotsky himself, which is that the Trotskyites spend all their time denouncing revolution and revolutionaries because apparently they're not perfect, and they end up aiding, one way or the other, the imperialists. Because what you're doing is you're taking your audience in the direction of believing that all the forces that are actually fighting US imperialism are wholly negative. Therefore, you lead your audience, you lead your party members in some cases, into basically a field of either utopianism or nihilism. Either utopianism, which says that it has to be this specific form of struggle, otherwise we cannot possibly go anywhere near it. But of course, when that doesn't come about, what happens to those who buy into it? They fall into nihilism, or they fall into becoming neoconservatives, to use the parlance of our times. And that's why part of the reason why there's so many Trotskyites who end up working in the State Department, because they go from ultra leftism to nihilism to cynicism to embracing the fact that they now support imperialism. And it's a very clear career trajectory.
Yes, I think just to flag some of the things that you just talked about before we go on to the next point, is that I think what he was trying, how he glossed it was that, again, kind of straw manning the Leninist Marxist position, is that, well, there's just like a shorthand. So whichever side is opposed to Western imperialism or US imperialism, that's the side we're on. And therefore they can have a simple analysis. They don't have to do a class analysis. They don't have to worry about if there's any kind of proletarian organization or who's actually, at the forefront of these anti-imperialist struggles. And second of all, which on his side is the same thing. So, but to use that as a way to go against it is also avoiding an in-depth class analysis, and especially with the type that you just talked about. So again, in a way, when he's pointing the finger at them or at other people, there's one's pointing back at him. And in terms of saying, well, there's just, it's both sides are capitalists, so what's the point? We're not going to get into competing. Why should we get in worry our time with picking one capitalist side over the other, or petty bourgeois over the bourgeois? Z. And I was thinking in terms of Russia, if that were to happen, even though America would say, okay, they're about democracy in Ukraine, if there was a balkanization, we all know that probably their favorite type of regime would be, a whole bunch of little Jordans, where you have people who will clamp down on the population and make great deals with Wall Street and the City of London and this type of thing, as if that would somehow be less devastating to the populations there.
Well, it'd be much more devastating. I mean, just look at what happened in Russia in the 1990s. That would be their preferred model. That would be what they would bring that back in a heartbeat if they possibly could. And there are a few of them in the ruling class in Russia who would do that as well. I mean, this is the thing about Putin, for all that he is a defender of the capitalist mode of production. The fact is, the reason why the response to him in the West is so hysterical is that he did put a stop to what I would call the comprador bourgeoisie's quite deliberate attempt to destroy the country on behalf of US imperialism. That's why he's regarded as such a villain. It's nothing to do with anything that they say that they're mad about. What they're really mad about is the fact that he did put a stop to the destruction and the breaking up of Russia by the agents of US imperialism, and that stymied their plans, and they will never forgive him for it.
So on that note, I guess before we could wrap up on this part with saying that, whereas Chris would say, it's just chasing around, or I guess tailism, chasing around whatever force is opposed to a U.S. imperialism or Western UK Western imperialism, U.S. imperialism, Western imperialism, and that his position is both the more, even for the people on the ground, is, I don't think he'd use moral, but the theoretically, the Marxist correct position is to just kind of not be bothered with it. Whereas what you seem to be saying is that, yeah, there are risks involved, of course, because no one has a crystal ball, and there's imperfect configurations on the ground, but that trying to pretend like being neutral on a speeding train, to quote Zinn, who I don't know if he's probably a democratic socialist, isn't really any profile in courage, Marxist or otherwise.
Well, the question is, like, when you're involved in such struggles, like, what is the way in which you actually do take the class struggle forward? So I'll take Chris on his own terms here. How do we, in an imperialist country, take the class struggle forward here? And this is a big question. And what we have to do is look at ways in which, how can we build the strength of the working class, but also how can we damage the strengths of the ruling class? And one of the big strengths of the British ruling class is its ability to move capital around the world and to extract profits from various different locations, often in a very brutal fashion. Therefore, if that becomes restricted, and if their freedom of maneuver with regard to that is removed, that, objectively speaking, helps our struggle, because it means that the ruling class no longer has the capability to use its City of London network to keep itself in profit, and therefore the crisis in this country, when it comes, will be more severe if they can't do that. Same in the United States. If they can't make profit from hyper-exploiting developing world nations, then that pushes the crisis of domestic capitalism further on. And again, if Chris had been reading Lenin seriously, rather than just pretending that Lenin was a liberal or whatever the other stupid thing he's been doing for the last however many years, he'd know that Stalin directly followed on from Lenin by arguing that there should be, and we should aim for, an alliance between the workers in the imperial core countries and the workers and peasants in the developing world, or it would be called the colonized world, or the neo-colonial world, who are struggling for sovereignty and independence. Now, the Trotskyite point of view is that sovereignty and independence are meaningless because it's all capitalism. But that, again, that objectively speaking, if we just to carry out a basic analysis of this, that isn't true. Because if you look at how class struggles develop much more rapidly and much more comprehensively, where the distortions introduced by foreign domination are gotten rid of. And so it may be the case, as the Chinese did, that you would need to make certain compromises with like a national bourgeois for a while, i.e. those in the capitalist class who are opposed to foreign domination. Yeah. So you may need to compromise with them in a joint struggle against foreign domination for a while. But you do so as a means of enhancing the class struggle in the long term. Meaning that if you join together in a joint struggle against foreign control of your nation, what you're doing is you're not tail ending the bourgeoisie. What you're doing is you are going into that movement for the specific purpose of, first of all, making sure or trying to make sure that it goes as far as it can and it can actually win that struggle. But also, as the Chinese did, you go amongst the masses who are drawn to that struggle against foreign domination, and you go amongst them with your program, and you introduce them to the Communist Party, wherever you may be, who are the hardest and the most sincerest fighters for national liberation, and who keep raising demands of the supposedly the national bourgeoisie, the bourgeoisie that says it's in favor of independence, to go further and to take and to wage the struggle in a more comprehensive fashion. That's how communists approached this in the early 20th century. It's how communists approached national liberation struggles. It's how communists successfully waged struggles in World War II against the Nazis. I mean, it's how the struggle in Albania was won. It's how the struggle in Yugoslavia is won by the partisan armies led by Tito, a controversial figure in Marxist-Leninist circles, but who undeniably won a huge victory over the forces of Hitlerite Germany by adopting these tactics. And so, if applied properly, these tactics lead you to a position where you're not tail-ending the bourgeois, but the bourgeois actually end up being exposed, because even those bourgeois who want to struggle for national liberation in the end will be held back by their class interests. But it's necessary for communists to join that struggle with our own point of view and to advocate for our point of view and win the masses over to our side. They'll be much more likely to listen to us if we've been in that struggle with them, not just standing to the side and going, oh, you're all just struggling for capitalism, go away, go away. Come back when you're ready for a real struggle. I will be in my armchair until you do. Who are you going to listen to? Are you going to listen to your brother or your sister in struggle? Or are you going to listen to a guy who's been sat there sneering at you for years and offering nothing to the struggle whatsoever? History shows that the former is more correct than the latter. The masses go towards those who have joined the struggle with them, with whom they become familiar and whose ideas they get drawn towards because they've seen these people in action, these organizations in action, not somebody who sits in an ivory tower periodically spitting on them. So I think that history is with us rather than with Chris on this point.
All right, and on just to pick up on two of those things before we go on to the anti-intellectualism, and because apparently you're also anti-intellectuals, which I guess means you don't appreciate your Adorno and whatnot, as you should. So two things. Yeah, he also he. I don't know if I don't know if he would say he's a Trotskyite, but he definitely is. He definitely says he's an Adornist or whatever that phrase is. But he did mention that whereas the Neo-Stalinist trend, as he wants to call them, typified by, I guess, would be Jackson Hinkle and Caleb Maupin and Midwestern Marx and Haas and the American Communist Party that's recently been installed, or trying to actually mobilize and build something on the ground across several states, is that he would say, okay, well, they want to look at the last 100 years and see a process of success. So that, how do you phrase it? That Lenin improved on Marx, and Stalin improved on Lenin, and Mao improved on Stalin and Deng Xiaoping improved on. You see where I'm going up through that. Again, that's where you think we focus on the block out all the bad authoritarian or bad stuff you have to do when you're dealing with internal and external contradictions and all kinds of things going on. So he wants to say that, whereas he would say, I'm an Adornist, and when I look back over the 100 years, I see a process of catastrophe.
Of course he does.
So those were two things. I don't know if you want to, we've already kind of touched on that. I just wanted to, the phraseology I thought was interesting, because you've already touched on the fact that we already talked about the importance of obviously the importance of the objective and the development of the material productive processes, but that's not, most people, and you're probably don't just focus on that exclusively to the exclusion of everything else. And then in terms of tailism, I thought it was kind of ironic when he made the point of saying that he doesn't think that this stuff is going to go anywhere. He doesn't think, he's like, they are saying that the quote unquote Neo-Stalinists are about with the working class and building proletarian socialism. But again, they're petit bourgeois radicals talking to other petit bourgeois radicals, the working classes, and then all interested in this and, this type of thing. And it kind of cracked me up a bit coming from the idea that most leftist organizations, including ones that call themselves Marxist, have tailed after every cultural thing that's gone on since the 70s, including up to this totally swallowing whole, at least officially, the gender ideology nonsense, as if that's going to be something that the average working class person is going to be, drawn to, as opposed to this more kind of patriotic, there's nothing un-American about communism, et cetera, that their group is trying to push.
Well, I mean, as you correctly point out, it's not just that the left has tail-ended every ropey cultural trend since the 60s. It's that in the American case, the American left tail-end the Democrats to this day. To this day, they are still tail-ending the Democrats. Some of them are going out there making videos justifying voting for the Democrats, even despite Biden, Harris, and all of the Democratic Party's assistance in the Israeli acts of mass murder in occupied Palestine. So like this, the American left, and again, we know Cutrone aligns himself with this point of view because he's openly said it, basically has rejected all the struggles in Palestine and called for the unity of Palestinian and Israeli workers. Well, I'm sure Kamala Harris would probably agree with that if she wasn't too drunk to understand it. But the point is that when you've got like supposedly Marxist organizations in the United States, like the PSL, who have spent, and the DSA, of course, spent their entire political lifetimes tail-ending and making excuses for either voting Democrat or arguing that, oh, well, we're up against fascism and therefore we have to, go along with the Democrats or have a popular front with them, which is what the old CP-USA argument was. So in a situation where the supposed parties of the working class have tried to shackle the working class to the corpse of the Democratic Party or the corpse of the Labour Party in our country for the last, 70 odd years, like to say that the struggles abroad have got struggles overseas have got a problem with asserting class independence or everybody's engaged in tailism. Well, let's start at home, Chris. Why don't we get our own house in order, which some of us are trying to do, rather than sitting there and saying, oh, everybody's just capitalist except me, which is essentially his argument. But you have a real problem with the fact that there hasn't been a working class political project worthy of the name since the CP-USA, and I'm talking in the US now, was destroyed effectively by McCarthyism by the early 1950s. And after that, you've had a series of radical attempts, but all of which were suppressed or destroyed by the state or co-opted. So why aren't we focusing on like rebirthing like American or British working class politics. In fairness to the ACP, they are at least trying to do that. And some of us are trying to do it here as well. And that's the tailism to be gotten rid of, the tailing of the liberal bourgeois, which again is again Marx wrote about this. Marx wrote about this after the defeat suffered by the French working class when Napoleon III came to power and declared his dictatorship in the early 1850s. Like, Marx made the observation that the working class got destroyed as a political force for effectively a generation. Same thing has happened to us. And yet you get people like Cutrone and Lane and others who are still tail-ending the liberal bourgeois on everything, which is why they embrace all of these weird things that the liberal bourgeoisie get into, like gender ideology, like bourgeois environmentalism and other things. They all just pop up and say that these are great, but let's have it more radical, you know? Because
and also that anybody that questions it is a reactionary, if you don't go along with the magic prefixes, you're some sort of right-wing reactionary.
Yeah, and you need to be blocked on Twitter. Possibly even arrested. But this is all that they're doing. Okay. They're just because they have given up on the working class as being the agent for historical change. So they just cling on to what they see as the most radical end of the bourgeoisie. And that comes in the form of the liberal bourgeoisie, who are the ones behind a lot of academia. They're certainly the money behind a lot of academia. And this is the reason why they promote all this weird shit. And then you got the other side of it, which is the avowed reactionaries, who are also liberals, by the way, just as a slightly different form of it, who are now trying to set up their own alternative, more avowedly right-wing version of this. But this is all the same like fight that the working class has no real role in. These are two different wannabe groups of intellectuals fighting over who gets the spoils from different wings of the bourgeois. Whereas the challenge actually is, how does the working class re-emerge with its own independent politics again, which it did used to have, which was deliberately destroyed. And I don't see Cutrone or any of the others putting forward a program to do that. I just see them sitting there and saying, wouldn't it be great if the liberal end of the bourgeois gave us a few more reforms, basically.
Yeah, and it's kind of like the Goldilocks but never finding the just right, So this this struggles is too much of something, and this struggle's not enough of it. So this struggles, they're too much focused on the objective, and this struggle is not. But there's never been one that's just that right. kind of sweet spot. Okay, moving on to the final point of this, because there was another one. There was two videos on this topic, but after I went through the first one again, I thought, okay, this is more than enough for one bad Trot take with Alexander Mckay. So we'll see if it could have just been more of the same. But anyway, another pox on the house of Leninist Marxists, aka what he's calling Neo-Stalinists, is this super oversimplification of Marx and anti-intellectualism. So me summarizing him, he's very critical of the rejection of the Frankfurt School and broader Marxist intellectualism. He claims that Neo-Stalinists extremely simplify Marxism into an anti-intellectual populist ideology that relies on emotional appeals rather than rigorous critique. And for him, this anti-intellectualism weakens Marxism's potential to challenge capitalism's complexities, and ultimately abandons its theoretical roots. So I want you to, so again, you can only speak for yourself, but I mean, because you are a Lenin Marxist, you identify, Alexander identifies, I'm not thinking at mouthing you here. He identifies as a Marxist-Leninist, and he's part of a Marxist-Leninist party. And he's been around, you can tell that he knows his stuff. So take it away. Anti-intellectualism, know your Frankfurt School, or suffer the consequences. I don't know.
Well, yes. Recite to me the entirety of One Dimensional Man. Otherwise, you're not a real Marxist. Look, this is something which has been alleged before, but I will speak for myself and my party here, which is that one of the things we absolutely insist on is a rigorous study of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin and Mao, and others as well. And the reason why we do that is precisely because, like, the actual system of scientific socialism and the Marxist-Leninist worldview got lost in the 20th century and got replaced by all of this garbage that people like Cutrone like to replace it with. So we insist that party members, when they join us, have to join rigorous study programs, have to attend them, have to demonstrate that they're learning the scientific socialist method of line of thought, have to demonstrate that they are learning and understanding it and becoming able to apply it. What we're interested in is developing party cadres who are thinking critical Marxist-Leninists, meaning that you can take the party's position and independently advocate for it without the need to refer back to somebody constantly. What we're doing is looking to train active, to use Gramsci's term, organic intellectuals. Organic intellectuals of the working class. That is what any communist party should be engaged in the process of training. So to say anti-intellectual is a nonsense. Now, I don't mean to dismiss anti-intellectualism as not being a problem. It is a problem because you do get people out there who say, oh, well, to use a t-shirt slogan I saw when I was an anarchist 20 years ago, bollocks to theory, that kind of thing. And there are people like that out there like that. But that Marxist-Leninists, and especially those who he's aiming this criticism at, can't really be accused of this. I don't think I can be accused of this. I don't think my party certainly can't. I don't think you can accuse Midwestern Marx of this either, because all of us, or the ACP, all of us insist on study, and real study, not just reading, but actual studying, discussing, learning from the Marxist classics as the bedrock of party activity. Whereas what Chris Cutrone is talking about when he talks about the complexities of Marxism, the complexities of capitalism, what he means is everybody should go and appreciate Adorno. You know, why aren't you appreciating Adorno like me, bro? You know, but the thing is, if you go back and you read, say, Engels' Origin of the Family, I mean, actually read it, not do what the blue hairs do, which is look at the title and say Engels said abolish the family.
Yeah, they said abolish the family, the heteronormative family. Like, okay.
Yes. Or you read Anti-Düring or Dialectics of Nature, you can see there that Marx and Engels, and talking about Engels specifically here, but Marx as well, very much appreciated the complexities of capitalism. Very much so. In fact, the reason why Marx's Capital was meant to be at least 4 volumes long, I think originally it was meant to be something like 6, was precisely because of the complexities that capitalist society was creating. And again, the problem with a lot of these Western Marxists who keep coming along and trying to invent some new version of the wheel, problem with a lot of them is they've just not read it. They've just not read the original books at all, and they certainly haven't studied them in any great depth, which is what communists used to do. So this is why you get like the much mocked and deservedly so, like a pronoun brigade, claiming that Engels said abolish the family, and literally doesn't say that. Doesn't say that. You can't even have an interpretation based on a ripped off quote about that, because like you've got to literally take several different pages out of context and present it as the reality. The reason why they can get away with that, though, is that too few people have read it. And this goes back to the genuine anti-intellectualism, not what Chris Cutrone is on about, but the fact that people stopped reading all of these things. And I don't blame people who were like born since like the 70s. This is just a general problem, which is that so-called Marxists just stopped reading Marx, stopped reading Engels, stopped reading Lenin. I mean, people like Cutrone, they didn't want to read Stalin or Mao in the first place. But if you read, just stick to Marx and Engels. You will learn, if you learn the dialectical method of analysis, if you learn about how to conduct analysis in this using the methods of dialectical materialism, you will learn to appreciate the complexities of not just capitalist society, but of the natural sciences, of the world that exists out there, in terms of the natural world, the scientific phenomenon, that kind of thing. It will open doors to new knowledge and new ways of understanding that can only be got to by the dialectical materialist method. And and that's why, again, we encourage people to learn that comprehensively. And the point about the Frankfurt School is, you don't need the Frankfurt School to tell you that the bourgeoisie places a great deal of value on the entertainment industry. I don't need 20,000 pages of Adorno to tell me that, because it's actually covered better in Gramsci. And again, Cutrone calls himself a catastrophist, because again, being an academic catastrophist is a great gig, because you can sit there and say, it's not going to work, bro. It's not going to work, bro. And you know what? A lot of the time you'll be proven right, because a lot of struggles end in failure, as Marx himself observed. But what are you doing? What political project are you engaged in to actually address the complexities of capitalism? Or are you just telling people to go off and read Adorno, which is basically all his project comes down to? So I reject the charge of anti-intellectualism, because what I do embrace, though, is the idea that the reason why Western Marxism is gone completely off the rails is that all of these people stopped reading Marx. All of these people started reading secondary, or like what you would best describe as like tertiary sources on this, which is basically bastardized versions from the 60s. And so return to the classics, read them, study them, and understand them, and stop going to take mongers like Cutrone and his carefully curated anti-Marxist views.
All right. Well, on that note, let's see if we've missed any thing before we get to our pre-decided on wrap-up question. So to make sure I didn't miss anything. So this was my Iron Man summary of Cutrone. Let's see. I'll just quickly go over this for people who were coming on a bit late. I'm pretty sure that you've touched on all of these things. And then at the end of this, I'll wrap up with the question of how you and Cutrone probably agree on something very important, but for very different reasons. And then we'll call it we'll wrap up our bad Trot take with Alexander Mckay. So Cutrone sees Neo-Stalinism, so today's Marxist-Leninism, as a contemporary approach that dilutes the core aims of proletarian socialism by substituting revolutionary defeatism with a bourgeois defeatism, focused on symbolic opposition to U.S. imperialism. He argues that neo-Stalinists conflate proletarian socialism with nationalism, often tailing authoritarian states like modern China, Russia, Iran, and also he would throw in there Hezbollah and Hamas and Palestinian armed resistance in general as being petty bourgeois, that they interpret as socialists due to their stance against Western powers. By promoting state power as revolutionary rather than examining class struggle on a global level, which is quite the abstraction, Cutrone argues Neo-Stalinism misleads the working class into supporting status quo powers rather than developing a path to genuine socialism. He criticizes their anti-intellectual stance, particularly in the rejection of Marxist critiques, especially those of the Frankfurt School, which Cutrone views as essential for navigating modern capitalism and avoiding ideological conformity. For him, Neo-Stalinism's simplified populist approach risks undermining the working class potential to build a truly revolutionary movement. And on that note, they mentioned in the episode that we're responding to here that he's never seen the left either in his lifetime or before. So I think the word was wretchedly petite bourgeois. And my guess is that you would, as you know, the left, as in, you know, the kind of the status of the leftists in the West, my guess is you would probably agree that it is quite wretchedly petite bourgeois, but for different reasons would be my understanding. But I don't want to put words in your mouth. You get the final word, of course, Alexander.
Well, I would say that he's right in the diagnosis in terms of what is the state of it, but wrong in all of the assumptions that he makes to all of the analysis that he comes out with to bring him to that conclusion. Yes, it is wretched and petty bourgeois, but the question is why? And the question has to be, you have to start with the fact that the left in the West, after really World War One, failed consistently to deal with the question of imperialism and what it means, failed consistently to analyze the divisions within the domestic working class caused by imperialism, which is meaning, as I've talked about before on here, the labor aristocracy and the organizations run by the labor aristocracy, consistently failed because the working class organizations, including communist parties in the end, became basically social democratic. And therefore, when the working class moved into revolutionary territory, as they did in the end of the 60s, there was a combination of selling out on behalf of the official communist movement, and then on behalf of the more radical element, moving into increasingly strange forms of rabid individualism when, like, the communist movement in the West failed and sold out. So this is why you end up in a situation where you have a left which is wholly petty bourgeois. You have a historic defeat of the working class. You have the destruction of what were supposed to be militant parties of the working class, or self-destruction in many cases. And you have the left that is, to coin a phrase, the leftover left, gathered around essentially the left wing of the bourgeois. That's the failure, a historic defeat and a disaster due to massive theoretical failures going back many generations, over 100 years, centered on a failure to understand imperialism, a failure to understand the division in the working class movement, and the conservatism that bred in the post-World War II period. And that is the root of the failure. And now we come to bring this up to the modern day, because the working class struggle hasn't revived to the point where it starts to shake the system. People who are attracted to Marxist ideas in the West just end up in organizations that are literally like left liberal organizations with like a Marx-ish face mask on. And so what they're led into is essentially left liberalism. It's just the left of bourgeois politics with no working class content in it whatsoever. That's the big failure. That's the reason why it's petty bourgeois. It's not because the left supports en masse anti-imperialist struggles. If the left supported on a mass basis anti-imperialist struggles, like in West Asia, occupied Palestine, like in the struggle against US imperialism conducted by the Russian Federation today in Ukraine, if the left was all in on that, then we'd have actually quite a different kind of left. What we've got, though, is a left which actually largely agrees with all the points of view that Mr. Cutrone puts forward, which is that the left opposes Russia, the left opposes largely China, the left rejects the various different forms of struggle going on in West Asia right now. They reject Hamas, they reject Hezbollah, they call for the overthrow of the Islamic Republic of Iran, just as 10 years ago they were calling for the overthrow of President Assad in Syria, just as before that they were calling for the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. And so the left in the West is entirely compatible with Mr. Cutrone's own obsessions. Like, he might like a few more symbolic strikes, maybe. But in actual fact, what he's hating there, to get psychological on him, if he really does hate it, is his own mirror image. Because the left in the West is basically personified really by him, which is a combination of ultra-leftist phrases and ultra-opportunist and objectively reactionary actions in terms of practical politics. And that's the left in the West today, and he represents it. So he should really do some analysis on himself and move on from there.
Well, that puts an I, that crosses the I, no, crosses the T and dots the I. Very nice. Thank you, Alexander. All right. Well, thank you very much. This has been our Bad Trot Takes with Alexander Mckay. Hopefully it'll be a regular, well, not that it's great that there's bad Trot takes, but,
but there's plenty of them.
It's nice to, anyway, you all know what I mean. Hopefully it'll be a regular thing as necessary. So anything you want to, anything you want to plug or announce before we say goodbye?
Just to say thank you, Tara, for having me on today. It's always a very good discussion that we have. And if people haven't watched it already, there's a very interesting interview we have with a Georgian Marxist on the channel today. Just went up a couple of hours ago. She's called Sopor Jabaridze, and we did an interview with her this morning, talking about the actual situation in Georgia. And I'm sure Chris Cutrone would find much to object to in her answers as well. So everybody should go over to the channel and watch that. It's a very interesting interview from a Marxist in a part of the world which is actually under the boot of imperialism, or imperialism's attempting to put the boot on it. So have a watch of that if you haven't done so already.
All right, I will add that to my to watch list. And I think most of the people watching right now are already followers of yours, but for those who are not, here is you can follow Alexander at Marx Engels LNIN on Twitter, and there's also a website, MarxEngelsInstitute.org, and he also writes things there, and of course the YouTube and channel and all that. Alexander, thank you very much, comrade, and we'll see. Who knows? Maybe someone on Sublation Magazine or Sublation Media will see this, and maybe we can have, maybe we'll be able to get a Cutrone or somebody on there. But I think it'd be really interesting for you two to have a discussion, because I find that normally, he doesn't normally talk about these things with someone who'd be able to push back, albeit in a comradely way. So that would be icing on the cake, but who knows?
Either that or he'll block both of us on Twitter.
That's right. Doug already blocked me because I'm, but whatever. It's fine.
All right.
You can tell I'm a meanie. Okay, thank you, Alexander. See you next time.
Thanks, Tara. Bye-bye.
Bye. All right, so it's been a Morbid Symptoms podcast. It's been the Bad Trot Take with Alexander Mckay. It's our second Bad Trot Take episode. Probably will be more since, as he said, there's no shortage of them. Please do like, subscribe, follow. We're on Rumble, YouTube, and X. If you come across a Bad Trot Take, let me know, or Alexander know. Or if you have another morbid symptom you want to suggest that we cover on the show, and also I'm always up for guest speakers, guest hosts, etc. It's always nice when I'm not talking into the void of the camera on my own. So thank you very much. In the video description, there's a link to the CutroneZone that Alexander was responding to. If you want to take that out, you don't have to take our word for it or his word for it. You can come to your own conclusions about how useful that is, and if it was pretty much a straw man argument that can't withstand much scrutiny, especially if you talk to serious Marxist-Leninists, sorry, like our good friend, comrade Alexander Mckay. So please do like, subscribe, and I will see you next time. Thank you very much.